Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first of many web lectures organized jointly by the early SIG 6 and SIG 7. Today, we will start with a lecture from Dr. Richard Meyer from the University of California, Santa Barbara, in the United States. Dr. Meyer is one of the most esteemed researchers in the field of cognitive psychology. His articles have over 200,000 citations, and he was listed as the top producing scholar in our field multiple times. In a yet to be published productivity study by Julian Röhle, Vincent Hugeide, and their colleagues, Dr. Myers also emerged as the most productive researcher in our field in the period between 2017 and 2022. Dr. Meyer is here today to give us a 45 minutes lecture, and after that we will have some time for questions. I will now leave the floor to Dr. Meyer.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me and see my slides?
Perfect.
Perfect. Great. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here with you today. And I appreciate so many friends and colleagues joining us. And I appreciate the invitation and the work of Vincent and the rest of the SIG 6 and 7 committee that organized this web lecture. I must say I'm heartbroken about the horrible things going on in the world right now, but I am looking forward to this talk. As some of you know, my research involves mainly the science of trying to apply the science of learning to education. And what I've really been trying to do is find instructional methods that help learners learn in a way so they can transfer what they have learned to new situations. And in particular, I've been investigating learning with technology. And so today I want to share some of our work on learning in virtual reality, which is a relatively new area for us. So I'm curious to hear what I have to say. Let's see here. So this is where I am. This is our campus at UCSB. I just wanted to share this with you. A more distant view. The psychology building is a little bit to the right of the little bell tower that's in the middle of the slide. So if any of you ever visit, we have a campus with, did I mention that we have beaches on 3 of our sites? Only kidding. So what I want to share with you today is first just an introduction to learning in virtual reality, some of the issues that we've been thinking about as we try to embark on this journey of trying to see if virtual reality might be a useful venue for learning, and how we can optimize learning in virtual reality. So then I'll look at some of the research that my colleagues and I have been doing in what I would call media comparison research. This involves the question of, do students learn better in an immersive virtual reality versus more conventional environments? And then I'll look at kind of a different genre of research, value-added research, where we'll look at if we're going to be learning in immersive virtual reality, what are the features of a lesson that would optimize learning? And then I want to share with you some ongoing projects, and I guess conclusion should have been a 5 here, and then just kind of conclude, see where we are. So just in terms of introduction, there's a lot of terms people use in this field of virtual reality, and I just wanted to kind of highlight the distinction that our field has, I think, agreed to. When we use the term immersion, we're really talking about the characteristics of the delivery hardware, the technology that's being used to deliver instruction. Wearing a head-mounted display and all the supporting software and hardware creates immersion. So immersion is an objective concept. We can kind of talk about the hardware, the features of the technology that's being used to produce virtual reality. Presence is really psychologically a more interesting idea, at least to me. And this is the learner's subjective feeling of being in a place that is artificially created by computer technology. So presence is a subjective experience, and we're trying to create in the learner the sense of being there, being somewhere. When we look at kind of the research field, I would break it up into kind of three levels of immersion. We could have no immersion, so this would be using maybe a conventional computer-based media, maybe a narrated slideshow, which my lab has studied a lot for a couple of decades maybe. Then we can have a low immersion virtual reality, which is still presented on a desktop computer or on some kind of computer screen that produces a two-dimensional virtual world. Or we can have high immersion VR, or what I would call immersive virtual reality, where you're in a three-dimensional world, generally wearing a head-mounted display, and you're able to kind of walk around in this world. And that's really the level of virtual reality that I want to focus on in this talk, looking at immersive virtual reality. A problem that we encounter, though, when we're trying to create learning experiences in IVR or immersive virtual reality is that immersive virtual reality can be quite distracting, and learners have a very limited capacity for processing information. And if they are overwhelmed by the perceptual richness of the environment and the ability to move through it, they might not have as much capacity left over for actually processing the academic content. So I know many of you are familiar with this kind of distinction among different types of processing that compete for the limited working memory capacity that learners have. Extraneous processing is cognitive processing that doesn't support the instructional goal. Immersive virtual reality can contribute to extraneous processing because it creates kind of this feeling of arousal by all the perceptual richness in the environment. Essential cognitive processing, this is processing aimed at getting the essential information into your working memory. So if it's a lesson on the characteristics of the cells in the bloodstream that you're learning about in virtual reality, kind of getting that information in your working memory. And then generative processing is this deeper processing aimed at mentally reorganizing the material into a coherent structure and integrating it with your relevant prior knowledge. So the problem is we really want these higher levels of processing, especially generative processing, but VR can create so much extraneous processing that we don't have capacity left over. So kind of to lay it out in a little table, I think immersive virtual reality has some promise, but it has some pitfalls. At this point in studying it. I'm still pretty agnostic about the potential of immersive virtual reality. I think it does have promise, but we've got a ways to go before we really understand how to, I think, create learning environments that are going to really help people learn. So in terms of promise, immersive virtual reality, kind of its strong point is that it's very motivating. Students overwhelmingly report liking learning in virtual reality. So it's emotionally arousing. People have strong positive affect for it. They feel motivated. And when you're motivated, that might cause you to want to try to really understand the material, get more involved with it. So it could lead to more generative processing. But a pitfall is that it also leads to increased distraction. And that distraction would increase extraneous processing. So we kind of have, we have to balance out the motivating features of immersive virtual reality with the distracting features. So that's just kind of a brief introduction. I hope it sort of made sense. I'm going to look at these two different research genres that my colleagues and I have been involved with, and our larger field has been involved with, kind of media comparison research I'll look at first, and then value-added research. So by media comparison, I'm really asking the question, do people learn better with immersive virtual reality or with conventional media? And as many of us know, there's a long history of controversy with media comparison research. It's very difficult to create a true comparison where you have enough experimental control that you can draw a conclusion, because media is often confounded with method. And it's hard to tell what's really causing any effect if there is one. But of course, in all our studies, everything's perfect, so we'll know for sure what's going on. Well, we try. So let me just kind of summarize some of these, because I knew we wouldn't have time to go step by step through all of these. But one of the earliest studies that Roxana Moreno and I worked on involved learning about really the ecology of plants in a little game-like environment called Design a Plant, where you travel to another planet and you meet this little character, Herman the Bug, and he explains to you the environmental conditions on the planet, and you have to design a plant that would survive there. You have to choose the roots, the stem, and the leaves. And then you see what happens, and Herman explains why your plant flourished or didn't flourish. So maybe if it's a windy environment, you need leaves that are not, have spaces between them, so that when the wind blows, they're not going to fall over. Or depending on the amount of rain, how deep the roots should be. What we did in some of these studies was to compare playing this kind of interactive learning experience on a desktop computer, or in a virtual reality environment where you have a head-mounted display and you are kind of walking around and trying to learn in the same environment. This was before we had Oculus Quest or the HTC Vive, so our lab had to like create the hardware. So it was not as good as what we have today, but it did create a sense of presence. And you can see, if you look on the right here, comparing learning in virtual reality versus learning just on a desktop computer, we're getting kind of mixed results. In some cases, so the positive effect size means that learning in VR resulted in better learning outcomes on retention and these are transfer tests, so on transfer tests, and the negative, you're doing worse. So it's kind of 50-50 here. In some studies you do better, some worse. We're not getting very strong indication that learning in VR was any better than learning on a desktop computer. Kind of then the next phase, Jocelyn Perong and I tried, I think we used the HTC Vive, and we had some off-the-shelf lessons on what's in the human bloodstream, taking a journey through the human bloodstream. So you're in VR and you're on this trip through the bloodstream and you're learning about all the cells that you meet along the way, versus just seeing a slideshow that has the exact same information, the same screenshots from the lesson, the exact same script that explains the cells, but just present it on as a slideshow rather than as this VR learning experience. And you can see here on the right from the negatives that people are learning better from the slideshow than from being in VR. In one case, it's negligible, in the other, it's pretty large. And then we kind of had the same situation with a lesson on it's kind of a military history from from a battle in World War II. And there's a IVR version of it where you're wearing a head-mounted display and really being there on the battlefield, seeing everything going on, versus a 360-degree video on a computer screen, which has the exact same content, same visual content, but you can't walk around in it. You have to, you don't have that feeling, as much of a feeling of presence. You can see here again, the people do better with the more conventional media, with the control group, with the video, than with IVR. And then Guido Makransky and his team included me in some of their studies. For example, learning about learning in a science, virtual science lab in immersive virtual reality versus either on a desktop computer or video on a desktop computer. We're not getting if you look on the right, we're not getting very strong differences between the groups. The effect sizes are pretty small and inconsistent. So if you look overall on the right here, we have about half the effect sizes are positive, which means people do better in virtual reality, and about half are negative, which means people do better with conventional media. So we're kind of left with not strong evidence that taking our current instruction and putting it into virtual reality would be helpful. So that's kind of sad if you're kind of a proponent of immersive virtual reality. But to me, I take it as a challenge to see what can we do to make learning experiences in virtual reality more effective, because we want to kind of play on the motivational power of virtual reality, but also build in instructional features that are going to make sure people focus on the content. So our main problem is, how do we get people to reflect on the material and not be so overwhelmed and distracted by VR? So I want to, well, before I do that, I should have shown you these pictures of some of the studies. So this is showing you from the study by Jocelyn Perong and I. On the left is a screenshot from an IVR lesson on Journey Through the Bloodstream. And on the right are some of the slides that use screenshots and the same wording as the lesson. On here we have a screenshot from the Design a Plant game from Moreno and I, and on the right, military history lesson. Oops. sorry. Yeah, okay. So let's shift gears now and look at value-added studies. How can we improve learning in VR? Because we see that there's not a lot of evidence maybe that just taking a desktop lesson and putting in VR helps. So we want to see, can we optimize learning in VR? So I have two kinds of approaches to this. One is to add design features that we know from our research on multimedia learning seem to be helpful, to see if they also apply in learning in immersive virtual reality. And then looking at some generative learning activities that we could insert maybe in lessons to get people a little more focused on reflecting on the content. So first, the first set of studies in this table looks at the modality principle. So this is the idea that the words in the lesson should be spoken rather than printed on the screen. So if we have a VR lesson, in this first study, you're learning about the fuel system of an aircraft. You walk around and you can turn the gauges and see how everything works. And then there's a voice that explains what's going on, or there's text on the screen that has the exact same words, but just printed on the screen. And then we give people a transfer test. People do much, much better on that transfer test if they're getting the words in spoken form rather than printed form. And that's also true for our Design a Plant game with Roxana Moreno and I. If Herman the Bug's explanation is spoken, people do much better on a transfer test. You can see the effect sizes are very large on the right here, versus if his explanations are printed on the screen as a caption. So that kind of is showing us that the modality principle seems to be applying in virtual reality. Let's see. Vikransky and his colleagues have found some interesting issues. Oh, I need to mention personalization also with the Design a Plant. When Herman talks in conversational language rather than formal language, so like when he says I and you and we, so that's conversational. In virtual reality, people learn a lot better. We're getting a huge effect size, greater than 2, which is kind of unheard of. So those principles seem to apply. And then Guido Vikransky and his team, that was kind enough to include me in some of the studies, also found that pre-training in some of the key concepts, so you know the names and the characteristics of some of the features, and you get to actually experience some things before you start. Pre-training is effective, and in a lesson on climate change and in a lesson on lab safety, matching the gender of the on-screen agent that you're working with to the learner's gender can be helpful. So those are kind of design features that look like they're promising. I'm not sure where these are all going to go, but what they tell me is it's possible to improve learning in immersive virtual reality with pretty large effect sizes, so that we can still have the motivational have instructional methods that are effective. Which is generative learning activities. So this involves embedding activities that help people learn. So for example, in the bloodstream lesson with Jocelyn Perong and I, summarizing, and so we stop the lesson and we ask students to summarize what they've learned so far. That improves learning on a transfer test with an effect size of 0.66, or asking them to answer questions that improves performance with an effect size of 0.57, or in the war history, just 0.21. And Guido Makransky's team looking at learning in a science lab, having people act out, stop and kind of act out physically what they're learning, that also helps. So these are generative learning activities that we can embed in an immersive virtual reality lesson that help people maybe reflect and focus more on the content of the lesson. And just to give you some graphics here, so this is an example of actually acting out a science lab exercise. So, and this on the right is a kind of pre-training with seeing melting ice caps. This is a study on learning about lab safety, either with a young woman in a white lab coat, which girls learn better with, or having a kind of overhead robot who's interacting with you, which the boys do better with. So what do we have so far? Let's see how I'm doing for time. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So what do we have so far? In terms of media comparison, IVR is not really necessarily better than conventional media, but on rating surveys, it's certainly liked better. Students like IVR better. And the problem is IVR creates more distraction than conventional media. So on measures of extraneous cognitive load, IVR comes out higher. In terms of value-added studies, learning in IVR can be improved through the modality principle, personalization principle, pre-training, or generative activity principles. So these kind of features can guide learners to focus more on the core material. So I kind of come away feeling IVR has promise in terms of motivation, but pitfalls in terms of distraction. So I want to take a few minutes here to look at some of our ongoing research, so you can kind of see kind of what's coming up for us. We're working on a meta-analysis that's a kind of media comparison between learning in immersive virtual reality and learning the same content with conventional media. We did a very extensive survey of the literature and found 50 comparisons. I don't really have great results for you yet, but I can just, in terms of our preliminary look at it, we had criteria for just determining whether the control group and the experimental group, so the IVR group and the conventional group, were actually comparable in terms of content and duration of the lesson, so that the only difference was the medium. We only, out of the 50, we only found 11 where the two groups were actually comparable, so where we had an actual true media comparison study. In 2, they fell into the category of likely comparable. 16 were definitely not comparable, which means the control group was different than the experimental group in fundamental ways. 6 where it was likely not comparable, and 15 where there wasn't enough information to tell. So we're kind of in this depressing situation where only 26% of the studies actually were designed in a way that you can draw conclusions. So that's not a great start to looking at media comparison research, but it does kind of tell us something about what we're facing when you do media comparison research. Let me just look at a couple studies going on, and then we can have time for questions. So one issue that occurred to Alyssa Lawson and I is that learning in virtual reality might be particularly problematic for students who have low executive function skills. So students who have a hard time controlling their attention, who maybe are not neurotypical in that sense, may be particularly at risk when they're learning in virtual reality. So we had students take a battery of executive function and working memory capacity tests. Then they learn a IVR lesson about ocean acidification, or they get the same lesson as a slideshow, and then they take a post-test. What we find is that executive function scores correlate with a comprehension test for the IVR lesson, but not for the slideshow lesson. So this is telling us that students with low executive function skill might be particularly harmed by distracting media like IVR. The slideshow is less distracting. It's clearer what the actual content is. There's not as much going on the screen, so they don't need to control their attention as much, or not being able to control your attention as well isn't as harmful. But when you are learning in virtual reality, it is harmful. I think I have some graphics. So these are slideshow. The left are slide screenshots from the IVR lesson. On the right, screenshots from the slideshow lesson. So this is about kind of a environmental science lesson about ocean acidification. It's kind of hard to maybe see these graphs, but what this is showing, if you look at the orange line, I guess is how it looks on my screen. For the IVR lesson, there is there's a correlation between performance on the flanker task, which is a task that looks at executive function for being able to, I guess we would say, inhibit irrelevant information. There's a correlation between that score on that test and learning in IVR, but for the blue line, the slideshow, there isn't. So executive function skill is correlated with executive function skill is correlated with learning in IVR, but not with conventional media. Another way to look at this is to try and see if we could mitigate this by providing some pre-training. So we have the same lesson and we give some students pre-training in learning in VR, because maybe the problem is people just aren't used to VR. For a lot of them, this is the first time they've been in VR. So we give them another VR experience before they get this lesson. So things are the same as the other study, but except some groups get pre-training and some don't. What we find here is kind of the same results in terms of executive function. Executive function scores correlate with the comprehension test on the IVR when you're learning in IVR, but our pre-training didn't improve learning. Presumably, that just wasn't enough experience. I can again show you some of these graphs. So these are all looking at various measures of executive function, performance on the NBAC, and performance on the operation span task. There's a positive correlation between scores on those tests and learning in immersive virtual reality, both on the left for the IVR lesson and on the right for the IVR lesson with pre-training. So we're getting a pretty strong indication that learning in virtual reality can be particularly challenging for students who have attentional control issues. So virtual reality, there might be kind of an equity issue here in terms of virtual reality might be particularly difficult for students with attention deficit difficulties. And so we need to figure out ways to mitigate that. And this is showing there's no difference between the pre-training group and the no pre-training group. Let me just close with one kind of last study here, where we tried a different approach to pre-training. Here we have a lesson on pipetting, thanks to the McCransky lab who shared it with us. And in this lesson, you learn a kind of technical procedure of how to do a serial dilution using pipettes. And what we do here is you learn the procedure in virtual reality, and you carry it out in virtual reality. Then you carry out a similar procedure in person with real pipettes, and then you take a knowledge test. One group gets pre-training. They see a little video that shows pipettes, all the parts of the pipettes, so you know what the key elements are and what their characteristics are before you get into virtual reality. And what we find is that the students who get this pre-training video, where they're just exposed to the names and characteristics of the key elements in the lesson, they make fewer errors on the transfer test to in person. So after they've learned in virtual reality, and now we give them a kind of an in-person task, they make fewer errors, and also they score higher on our knowledge post-test. So this is telling us that our pre-training helped improve learning in immersive virtual reality. So we see that as promising. And here are just some screenshots of kind of what the VR experience feels like when you're learning to pipette. On the right, these are instructions for the task that you're learning in VR for serial dilution. Then we have the in-person version of a dilution task as a kind of transfer test. You can see this is kind of a picture of our lab. Sorry, it's so messy, and I don't know why there's a box with garbage in it here, but just shows you it's an active lab where things are going on, I guess. So students have to come in, they have to put on their white lab coat, and they have to work with the actual test tubes and pipettes. Here are the results. The two bars on the left are learning in virtual reality. So these are the number of errors committed. You can see the no pre-training group commits a few more errors than the pre-training group when they're learning in VR, but that difference turns out not to be significant. But on the right, where it says IP, this is in person. So now when you're doing the serial dilution in person, the students who learned with pre-training make half as many errors as the students who learned without pre-training. So that is that's kind of catching our attention. And also, if we look at the knowledge test, the pre-training group is scoring 18.65 and the no pre-training group 17.23. And that's a significant difference. So that's telling us just in their knowledge of what, just a multiple choice test on what they've learned, the pre-training group is doing better. So that's promising work, showing us that there might be ways to improve learning in virtual reality. So our conclusions from this are that we need techniques to mitigate the distracting features of learning in virtual reality. Atypical students who have executive function difficulties need help in overcoming distractions and learning in immersive virtual reality. Pre-training might be a particularly useful technique, at least we found in our one study, and learning about ocean acidification and IVR wasn't improved by the kind of pre-training that we use. So it's important to have pre-training that focuses on the key elements in the lesson. So just to summarize, I think our main success story in our recent research is that learners were better able to transfer their learning of a technical procedure in virtual reality to performing the skill with real materials, which is kind of always what we're trying to do, if they saw this pre-training video that showed and described the main elements in the lesson. So I think this is a promising first step, but we certainly have a lot more work to do. And here are some of the references from some of the studies that I talked about in case you're interested. And I'm glad to share these slides with everyone. So maybe I should stop the screen maybe and answer questions. Is that where we should go now?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very insightful talk, Dr. Mayer. Again, thank you for being willing to do this at 8 o'clock in the morning. We have a very nice and healthy audience of around 120, 130 people. So there's a lot of people who appreciate it. For the audience, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button that's next to participants. On my screen, it's at the bottom of the screen. So we being the SIG coordinators will relay the question that you have to Dr. Mayer. I will start with one question, if I may.
Sure.
In your very honest view, how promising do you consider the virtual reality technology? Because it's being hyped a lot, yet some of the initial results are perhaps somewhat disappointing, and there's the issue of extraneous processing. And I wondered whether how the promise relates, for instance, to AR, whether AR might be more or less promising. Can you share your thoughts?
That's a really good question. Well, you know, I share with you the observation that there's a lot of hype for VR, and a lot of people are making very strong claims that learning in virtual reality is just obviously a better way to learn, and pretty soon all instruction is going to be in VR. But if you look at the history of educational technology over the last 100 years, you see claims like this for every new technology that comes along. People make these strong claims, then educators try to implement them. 10 years later, we find out really didn't help very much, and then we just go on to the next thing. So I'm hoping that doesn't happen for virtual reality, because now we're able to do research and figure out how to implement it in a way that could be effective. So I'm hoping we'll be able to do that. But my honest assessment is, at this point, there's not strong evidence that learning in virtual reality is more effective than learning with conventional media. But I'm not willing to give up on it yet, because I just think it is so motivating, and students like it so much that they might be willing to spend more time learning if we can develop lessons that would actually teach them something. So I think students are willing to put in the time in VR if we can develop actual experiences that are going to help them learn. So I really want to focus on, can we develop instructional methods that are going to improve learning in virtual reality? Does that answer your question, Vincent?
Yes, definitely. Just a part in relation to AR, could you briefly expand on that?
Yeah, I think there's potential there. We haven't really studied it, so I don't feel like I have a lot of good firsthand experience, but it's definitely worth investigating.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer. We have some questions in the Q&A already. The first one that came out is the question of the learning outcome, how we measure learning outcome specifically in VR, and how do we make sure that the results that we obtain are not depending on the type of learning outcome. So whether we look into recall, application of procedure, our ability to make inferences, and how do you believe that this would impact what we actually find?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. And that's one thing I have found in my research is the hardest part is designing assessments of learning outcome, because we want to know, did people learn anything useful from the lesson? It's developing techniques to measure that are hard, especially if we're interested in transfer, which I am, and I'm sure most people who have educational interests. Our focus is not just on retention. I mean, retention is important, but we also want people to be able to take what they've learned and use it in new situations. So developing good transfer tests is really important. So all the effect sizes that I reported are based on transfer tests. And generally, our transfer tests are open-ended essay type questions where you have to explain something, kind of go beyond the lesson. Some of them might involve performance, like in the pipetting study, actually carrying out the performance in the real world rather than in VR. So that's kind of a transfer to the real world. So I guess those are the kind of transfer tasks we've used. Does that answer your question, or should I say more?
Well, that was a question from Calliope Benetos, actually, but I think, yeah, it gives a pretty good feedback on it. I see there are a couple of questions looking into pre-training. So maybe we can also look into that. And the question is, so there are several, I'm going to try to put them together. So the idea is that, so the first one is when you have pre-training, do you then evaluate the procedure in reality or in IVR or both? And then the other question is, what kind of what kind of task do you have for pre-training? Is it just so vocabulary that you give them in advance, or do you have pre-training in what they have to enact later on? And I would add to that, do you have anything on pre-training for the use of VR itself, actually?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question too. We're kind of planning a study along those lines of just pre-training and use of VR. We did find in that one study that Alyssa Lawson did that pre-training and use of VR didn't really help. So I'm thinking I want to focus more on the pre-training that did help, which was in the pipetting lesson on, we had just a very short video where you see the actual equipment. So you're seeing the actual test tube, the actual pipette, the place where you press down, so you can see what they look like in reality. Because in VR, they're not exactly the same as in as the real objects. So we're thinking maybe that helps you kind of relate it to your long-term memory. When you're in VR, you can relate it back to what these concrete objects looked like. And so you're learning the names of the objects, and you're learning what their characteristics are in that video. But you're not learning how to use them. You're just learning what they look like, what their names are, what the parts are.
Thank you. There's a question by Patrick Albus, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly, that says, thank you so much for your interesting talk. VR is particularly suited to teaching specific skills or action sequences, yet many studies have attempted to integrate like classic textbook learning material and then observe how this material is processed more effectively. Isn't this a fundamental problem that we are choosing the wrong medium for the learning material? So shouldn't it be better tailored to the benefits of VR, is the question.
Yes, that's a really good insight. I completely agree with that. I think VR has certain unique affordances, and just replicating a textbook is not a good affordance. It's probably not, even having text in VR is kind of tough. It's not really the best use of VR. So I completely agree with that. I think we have to find the niche for virtual reality, where it fits in, what it would really be useful for. It might be useful just as like in one of McCransky's studies, just to kind of motivate students to see what the environmental problem is. So to be at the ice caps and see them melting, maybe that will get you interested in trying to understand climate change. So we have to figure out where does it fit in, where can it be used. I mean, people suggest when you have situations that are too dangerous to do in real reality, you have to use virtual reality, or situations that are just impractical to try to work on in the real world, we can put in virtual reality. Or things that are, worlds that are too small or too large, we can create in virtual reality. So we just have to find the niches, I think, for VR. And also time-wise, people probably get uncomfortable after a certain amount of time in VR. So we have to kind of tailor our lessons to that time constraint as well.
Thank you.
From a different perspective, we have a question from Francesca Zermiani, who was from the University of Stuttgart, and she asks if you are aware of any research with embodied virtual agent in IVR, and whether it could be a mitigation strategy that would look into social interaction in IVR, as that whether that would actually distract students more.
Right. I think that's a really fun research question. I think maybe Jeremy Bailenson at Stanford has done some work along those lines, looking at having embodied agents in VR with you, seeing kind of the social effects. I think those are really interesting questions. I think it'd be fun to even create even a virtual classroom where you could actually control everything that goes on. That would be fun just to do some interesting classroom studies. So I think there's a whole world of research we can do that involves more that with social interactions between you and other agents that are in VR with you. And then I know there's lots of great applications, things like training surgery skills in VR, where you could have a expert physician kind of teaching you how to do the surgery, so you kind of practice together. I think that a situation like that has a lot of potential for teaching skills.
It's actually very interesting that you mentioned Jeremy Bailenson, because there's one question by Thomas Wynn that asks any thoughts on other types of learning, like identity, that Jeremy Bailenson has studied, and attitudes about sustainability.
Right.
So I guess that's kind of what you touched upon.
Yeah, I think Jeremy's work is just so interesting, so exciting. And I won't take total credit for it, but he was a postdoc at UCSB before he started all. So
I see. I did not know.
But so yeah, I think his work on I interpret it as developing empathy for other people by kind of being able to be in somebody else's shoes and walking around in virtual reality and seeing what that feels like. So I mean, I tend to focus on academic learning outcomes, learning about biology or learning a procedure, a technical procedure, but there are lots of other things you can learn. So you can learn these kind of social skills, you can learn maybe empathy for others. So, and maybe those are, maybe VR is better suited for those kinds of skills, what we might call soft skills, because you can create interactions in VR that if you mess up on, don't really count, but if you did them in the real world, yeah, they might be problematic.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer. Earlier, when you answered about the question of pedagogical agent, you were talking about classroom situation, and there was actually a question on whether you were aware really about actively of VR information for teacher education, and whether you think it would be helpful to train teachers for classroom management and motivation, interacting with students, things like that.
That's what I was thinking. I think it would be a terrific venue for, being able to make mistakes in a world that doesn't really count, but does kind of feel more real than, just reading a textbook that tells you do this, don't do that. But to actually be in a classroom and try things out and see how students react. So I think it has that kind of environment has lots of possibilities for, improving your teaching skills. And it has, as a researcher, it has lots of implications for just things like changing, you can have a teacher that is looking at it feels like every student feels like the teacher's looking at them. You can have it set up that way. So, I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities, I think, in virtual classrooms where we could use it as a research venue or as a training, as you're suggesting, as a training venue.
Thank you. There's a couple questions more. Are you still okay time-wise if we ask them to you?
Of course.
So there's one question by Inga Gloger-Frey from Germany. Doing research in the area of preparation to learn, I'm interested in your approach to pre-training and what that is exactly. So is it usually the approach like in the current study, so introducing key concepts, probably in the text? So for the studies with enacting, she said that I could see enacting play around with the tools as preparation as beneficial. What do you think?
I think that's a great idea. We did one study, it wasn't in VR, but many years ago, on a lesson on how how bicycle tire pumps work. So you watch this video that explains it, but it's an animation of a tire pump. So you might not quite understand how that relates to a real tire pump because the animation is kind of schematic. So before the lesson, we have people interact with this little plastic, clear plastic pump that we created so that you can see the inside of the pump when you pull up and down on the handle. You can see the inlet valves and the outlet valves opening and closing inside, which you normally couldn't see. So we just have people, pull up and push down a few times with that before the lesson. And then we have them watch the lesson and take a test. Having that pre-experience greatly improves their performance because I think it helps them relate what they're seeing in the lesson to their prior knowledge. So I think some kind of an enacting experience before you're in VR could be extremely helpful because it helps concretize what you're learning. And I think what it's doing is helping you relate it to your prior knowledge because VR is still kind of schematic, even though you feel present, but the objects they're not exactly the same as in the real world.
Want me to take that one? Okay. Thank you for your answers. There's a couple of questions also about augmented reality. So you already said that you don't do with it, you don't do as much research on AR as you do on VR. But I'll ask the question, and
Okay.
we can see what you think.
Sure.
So thank you very much for the wonderful speech. How do you evaluate the effect of AR and VR on learning? Can the comparison of AR and VR or the joint use of these technologies provide more meaningful results for us? And there was another question we can incorporate it in that basically asks if AR would lead to similar problems as VR or perhaps less so in terms of, for example, being overstimulating.
Right. I think you're, I agree with kind of the premise of that question that maybe ARs might be less distracting. So I think it may have, different affordances than immersive virtual reality. So it might have different uses. I know we've been involved with a few projects at UCSB with our colleagues in computer science trying to create a world where the name of objects just appear when you look at them so that you can it's really almost a vocabulary training program, but it is a lot less distracting, but it's still fun and it's still students like it, so it has the motivational power without being as distracting. And kind of the use that this project has seen for it is kind of really just building a vocabulary. So it might be that augmented reality has a slightly different niche than IVR, but I do think they're both exciting venues. I mean, what I would personally like is augmented reality when I open the hood of my car and look in, it would tell me what all those parts are.
That would help a lot.
Yeah. Like
Hey, I think most of the further questions were asked already. There are some other clarification questions. We will collect them and maybe, we can answer them later.
Okay.
I think also the slides will be prepared and maybe then we can have another look on it. Thank you
Sure.
really, really much for your wonderful talk. As a junior coordinator, I want to ask the last question, the final question for the jury members of our SIG. If you have any advices for us how we can proceed in our research, also on this topic using VR, AI. Yes.
Well, I think it's an exciting field that's just really in its initial stages. So I think it's a pretty wide open research field. So that has both its pros and cons. I mean, just about anything you can think of is probably going to be a contribution to the field. But we don't have a lot of pre-established methods or even content. So you have to kind of be a pioneer to work in this field. And I will say, I'd be glad to talk to anybody. Just if you want to talk further, please just email me. I'd love to hear your thoughts and get ideas. I mean, I think the way we move ahead in this field, it's a collaborative effort by this whole research community. So it's fun for me personally to talk to other people. I'm always glad to communicate on email. So just shoot me an email if you want to talk further.
Thank you very much for this opportunity and your fruitful insights.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer. Thank you, everyone. It was real nice to have everyone here. To finish this webinar, I have a couple of information I would like to share, which are linked to both our 6 and 7 SIGs. So the first thing is our second lecture, which will happen on May 3rd next year, and you're all invited to join again. And our speaker, maybe I can make it work. Our speaker is going to be Sharon Ainsworth from Nottingham University, and we will communicate the exact time later on. So mark the date already in your calendar. The other date you have to mark in your calendar, if you haven't done so already, is the conference, which will happen in August 21st, 23rd next year in Tübingen in Germany. And if you want to, you can now access the website using the QR code that is right here. And you will also find it with a link on our 2 SIGs web pages. We will send a call probably next week or so. That's everything on our side. So thank you again, Dr. Meyer. It was really nice to have you for our first lecture, especially at such an early hour for you.
Well, thank you for having me. And it's my pleasure.
Thank you very much. Then have a good day, everyone, and see you at the next web lecture.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.